the US, the murder trial of OJ Simpson was wrapping up, having been in and out of the headlines all summer. In his closing argument, Simpson's defence attorney, Johnny Cochran, repeated what he argued was the key piece of evidence exonerating the former football star. Gloves found at the scene, soaked in blood, did not fit him when tried on in the courtroom. The prosecution had argued that because the leather gloves had been soaked in blood, then frozen and defrosted multiple times during the process of preservation and analysis, they weren't in the same condition as they had been at the time of the murder, rendering the test meaningless, especially as Simpson was trying on the gloves over a pair of latex medical gloves. Cochran, making his closing remarks as the jury prepared to retire for deliberation, told them, "If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit." A snappy soundbite that was immediately picked up by media coverage and would later be parodied with South Park's infamous Chewbacca defence. And in the UK, the BBC's new 6-part adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice was broadcast and became an immediate hit, the final episode having a now unthinkable 40% of the audience share, and 8 other countries had already bought the rights by the time it finished. The BBC had a long history of adaptations of classic literature, but they'd come to be thought of as a little staid and stuffy. But for 1995, Andrew Davies's modern adaptation and zippy direction by Simon Langton proved a winning combination, as was the note-perfect casting, including veteran character actors Alison Steadman and David Bamber, Four Weddings and a Funeral's Anna Chancellor, and absolutely fabulous as Julia Sawalha. But the unexpected star of the show was previously unknown Colin Firth playing Mr. Darcy. The scene in which Darcy decides to cool off in a lake after an exhilarating horse ride remains one of the most famous TV moments of the era. In fact, the moment when Firth emerges wet and clad only in a shirt from the lake was voted the most memorable TV moment. Despite the shot not actually existing, it was never filmed and it was never broadcast. In the series as broadcast, a stuntman, not Firth, dives into and swims in a pond, and then the shot cuts to Firth walking back towards the house looking a trifle damp before having an awkward conversation with Elizabeth. Alain Prost had his second planned McLaren test at Silverstone just after the Italian Grand Prix, after which he sat down at the Buckingham Lodge restaurant with his friend Hugues de Chaunac, head of Oreca, and made a list of the pros and cons of taking the McLaren seat for 1996. In the end, he said he found the list of cons longer and more compelling. He still wanted to launch his own all-French team. The McLaren-Mercedes project would, he believed, still take several years to come properly to fruition, and he wouldn't see the benefits. And his sons Nicolas and Sasha had asked him why he wanted to continue putting himself in danger. After all, Ayrton was gone. And so, in Portugal, he announced, after some prompting from a journalist, that he wouldn't be returning to the fray, saying it had only ever really been a long shot anyway, but he would still consult with Ron Dennis and do a bit of testing for them, at least most supposed, until something more interesting came along. Great news, presumably, for David Coulthard, for whom this seemed to open the way, given he'd had a contract in his pocket for 6 months, though McLaren would only say that they would make an official announcement of their driver lineup at the next race at the Nürburgring. There was an announcement from Jordan, though, which said that Irvine and Barrichello would both be continuing with the team for 1996. Barrichello had, it would later transpire, been approached by Jean Todt, but the idea was vetoed by Michael Schumacher, who apparently was determined to have a dutiful number 2, not a rising star with ambitions. So Rubens put on his best PR smile for the cameras and said that he was staying put because Jean-Pierre Jabouille had given him guarantees that the Peugeot engine development would allow him to challenge for wins in 1996. His teammate, however, was noticeably more reticent about confirming his contract extension, which led to rumours that he was possibly being wooed by another team. Ken Tyrrell had signed up Mika Salo for another year. The young Finn was also highly rated, and some thought he might be in the frame for a better drive, but the limitations of the Tyrrell Yamaha meant he'd been unable to show his quality. But while Uncle Ken said he'd like to retain Katayama for another year, apparently nothing had yet been decided on that front. There was one change of lineup for this race. Giovanni Lavaggi's money had lasted 4 races, and evidently his performances hadn't inspired anyone to stump up more backing. But Pacific, still desperately short of funds, were able to find another driver willing to part with someone else's cash to take the wheel. Swiss driver Jean-Denis Delatraz, who had proved to be the last man to drive a Larousse F1 car in anger. Car number 16, Jean-Denis Delatraz. Delatraz's sole Formula One race, the 1994 Australian Grand Prix, had not been the ideal debut. In his defence, he'd never even sat in the car before that weekend, didn't have a lot of single-seater experience in general, and was physically unfit, and he did manage to qualify faster than Mimmo Schiattarella in the Simtech, but proved desperately slow in the race, 2 seconds slower than teammate Hideki Noda, and 6 slower than the leaders. Noda retired first, while Jean-Denis kept it running for 56 laps until, 10 laps behind, his gearbox cried enough and he pulled off, bringing, as it turned out, the competitive history of the Larousse team to an end. He was even singled out by the BBC's Jonathan Palmer as having no business in Formula One. Following that, he was signed up by French driver Fabien Gillois to support his self-entered McLaren F1 GTR in the 1995 Le Mans race, along with fellow F1 veteran Olivier Gouillard. It went reasonably well. While Yannick Dalmas, JJ Leto and Masanori Secchia beat the rain in their own McLaren to take the win in the manufacturer's first attempt at Le Mans, Gillois, Gouillard and Delatraz came home fourth in their category. With this modest success under his belt, and the promise of more funding from Swiss watchmaker Frank Müller, an increasingly desperate Keith Wiggins was persuaded to sign him on for the rest of the season. In other news, Aldo Costa was leaving Minardi as technical director to go to Maranello, overseeing Ferrari's future GT programme, while persistent rumours said that Rory Byrne and Ross Brawn, two of Benetton's top engineering team, were also said to be on the verge of signing terms at Ferrari, which the Italian press suggested meant it was soon to be curtains for the widely disliked John Barnard. For now, though, the Benetton team had a new front wing on the B195, along with revised brake calipers and a completely new front suspension, featuring a third damper linked directly to the anti-roll bars, something Arrows had come up with in 1994, which Williams had then copied. McLaren, meanwhile, had the C version of the MP410, with a new gearbox casing, again, and redesigned rear side pods and rear suspension. But the biggest change of cars was the rollout of the FW17B, which had a completely rebuilt rear suspension to accommodate a brand new transverse gearbox and significantly revised aerodynamics, with exhausts blowing above the diffuser and the removal of the wing profile cladding on the upper rear suspension wishbone, introduced the previous season. The new gearbox had better cooling in its hydraulics, which had been a major problem so far this year, and Renault had also made some improvements to the electronic engine mapping. And finally, Gerhard Berger was sporting a one-off helmet design, the result of a competition for his fan club, featuring a selection of national flags and the message "No War in the World," slightly undercut by the Marlboro branding. After 2 races with qualifying affected by weather and, in the case of Monza, new tarmac, the weather in Portugal was glorious, and the local media were excited to see Pedro Lamy back in action on home tarmac. Friday's session saw the 2 Williamses on top of the standings, Hill just a tenth ahead of Coulthard, with Schumacher third, finding the Benetton twitchy and difficult to handle on the dusty surface. And just as at the Hungaroring, the dust meant that Saturday's session would be quicker, and so it proved. Well, mostly. The new McLaren turned out to be very difficult to set up, and while Blundell improved his Friday time by nearly 1.5 seconds, Hakkinen couldn't. But the new Williamses were the class of the field, and after a tough battle between teammates, David Coulthard had his third pole position, more than 3 tenths ahead of Hill, with Schumacher third, having again not found the right setup until quite late on. He would line up alongside Berger, with Frentzen a fantastic fifth in the Sauber, alongside Herbert, who had as usual found his car lacking grip. Alesi, still looking shell-shocked from his retirement in Italy, was 7th, while the next 4 places were filled by the Jordans and Ligiers, Barrichello, Brundle, Irvine and Panis. The McLarens were all the way back in 12th and 13th, and for the first time this season, Mika Hakkinen was outqualified by his teammate, Blundell's improvement on Saturday having nudged him just ahead. Newly married Jules Bouillon didn't set a time on Friday before ending up in the gravel, and could only make 14th on Saturday. The Tyrrells were also struggling for grip, both drivers trying hard just to keep it on the track, and Katayama one of only 2 drivers, other than Hakkinen, not to improve on Saturday. Next up were the Minardis, Lamy getting the better of Badoer, probably about the best he could have hoped for, and behind them the Footworks, with Inoue the other driver whose best time was on Friday. 15th then, dropping to 19th, but still enough to outqualify Papis. And then, as usual, the Pacifics and 40s, with Delatraz predictably bringing up the rear, though he was additionally hampered by being disqualified on Friday for pushing his car back after a spin, and then having persistent transmission trouble on Saturday, Nonetheless, his time, 7 seconds slower than Montemini and over 12 seconds off pole, would have only seen him 23rd on the grid for Saturday's F3000 race. That evening, though, Williams mechanics discovered a fault in the bearings on Hill's new gearbox, and with only the old gearboxes available as replacements, and incompatible with the FW17B's new suspension, the team took the decision to race with the A-spec cars instead, giving them only the warm-up to get the settings right. Over in the McLaren garage, a similar decision was being made. The MP410C was just not working and needed some more work. Ron Dennis decided to split the difference. Hakkinen would race the B chassis as per Monza, while Blundell would experiment with the B chassis but with C bodywork on top. None of that was known to the press, of course, who were asking one question of the two Williams drivers. Would David Coulthard move over for Hill if the situation developed, putting aside his own ambitions for the win for the sake of Damon's title chances? "I've been faster than him all weekend, I'll run my race accordingly," was Coulthard's take. "I asked David if he was interested in second place, and he said no," added Damon. One successful parade lap later, the cars lined up ready and away they went, with Coulthard getting a great start again to retain the lead, but back in the pack there were two separate incidents. Right at the back, Katayama got away poorly, and his left rear clipped Badoer's right front. The Minardi speared right into the pit wall, but the Tyrrell was launched into the air and cartwheeled into the barrier, bouncing off and ending up upside down, almost astride the nose of Moreno's 40. Meanwhile, at the braking point for the first corner, Brundle had tipped Frentzen into a spin which sent Barrichello clattering across the gravel to avoid it. As the red flag came out, Ukiyo was carefully extracted from his cockpit and sent off to the circuit's medical centre and thence to hospital in Lisbon. He'd sustained a blow to the head and was complaining of neck pain, so you can understand why they were cautious, but fortunately it transpired that he was just a bit bruised and shaken, but had no serious injury. So, just as in Italy there would be a restart, and just as in Italy, two drivers would not make it. Katayama, obviously, and Papis, whose gearbox had failed, and he was a good foot taller than his teammate Inoue, for whom the spare was set up, so he'd have to sit this one out. Montemini, Moreno and Badoer would all start in their spares from the pit lane. And there was more chaos as they got away for the second parade lap, as Frentzen stalled his Sauber, leading to a big snarl up behind as everyone tried to get past, with a lazy stuck until Frentzen finally got moving. The cars, including Frentzen, all filtered back up to where they were supposed to be on the grid, until the Sauber team informed the German that he was going to have to pull over and let everyone back past because he needed to start from the back. He would be hoping that this would go down as a simple misunderstanding and he wouldn't be further penalised, as his countryman Schumacher had at Silverstone last year, for overtaking on the parade lap. And so, finally, everyone was ready to go again. And again, Coulthard got it just right, while Hill got a bit of wheel spin and Schumacher piled through into second, with Herbert getting a flyer and going up briefly to fourth before dropping behind Berger. So as they went through the infield, it was Coulthard, Schumacher, Hill, Berger, Herbert and DeLazy in the top 6 places, followed by Brundle, Irvine, Barrichello and the two McLarens, which had both got good starts to go ahead of Panis. Charging from the back, Frentzen overtook Delatraz, Diniz, Inoue, Lamy and Salo on lap 1, and was already ahead of the three who started in the pit lane, of course, so he was 14th by the time they came round to finish the lap. Coulthard had put his foot down and was 1.2 seconds ahead already at the end of the first lap. It was 2 seconds by the end of lap 2, as Frentzen kept moving up, while Hakkinen passed Blundell and set about Barrichello, the Finn's Monza-spec McLaren obviously working better for him than Blundell's hybrid. On lap 5, Panis's poor start was exacerbated by yet another jump-start penalty. Ligier were really going to need to work on that. By then, Schumacher was over 4 seconds behind a flying Coulthard, with Hill still hot on his heels but unable to find a way past, the pair leaving Berger, Herbert and DeLazy far behind. Lamy came in to retire with a broken hydraulic pump in his gearbox at the end of his 7th lap, by which time the leaders were already lapping Delatraz, running 10 seconds a lap slower. Moreno was the latest victim of gearbox woes, though his team decided they might as well send him out anyway, just as Panis finally came in to serve his penalty, and in his desire to make up time he promptly overcooked it coming out of turn 3, parked it by the barriers and walked back in. Further back, Frentzen's progress had stalled a little as he inherited 12th from Panis, but now had the McLarens and Jordans ahead. Hakkinen was still firmly attached to the back of Barrichello as they fought over 9th. The Jordan was oversteering all over the place and was clearly holding up Hakkinen, with Blundell, Frentzen and Bouillon now queued up behind. Heinz-Harald squeezed past Blundell and quickly attached himself to Hakkinen's tail as the first pit window approached, most drivers expecting to go for 3 stops today. As they finished lap 16, Barrichello slithered and nearly collected Hakkinen, but it had put Mika close enough to get a tow down the main straight and slingshot past into turn 1. Frentzen charged past with a late braking manoeuvre at the tight turn 9 hairpin, forcing Barrichello out wide, and he nearly collected the other McLaren as he regained the line. Lap 18 and Schumacher and Hill came in together for their first stops of 3. Disaster for Williams though. 7 seconds stationary for Schumacher, but Hill's right rear wouldn't go on, then he couldn't get first gear to engage, and he finally got moving after 16 seconds, emerging 5th, though Berger came in behind him, so once Herbert and Alesi had made their stops, he should return to 3rd place. At the end of the next lap, Coulthard made his stop and had a sufficient gap over Schumacher that even with a slightly slower 10 seconds, he still returned to the track in the lead. Herbert's stop was another good one, just over 8 seconds, while Hakkinen made an 11-second stop, putting in a bit more fuel. Alesi had stayed out. He was on a 2-stop strategy and was holding up a charging Hill, who only had a limited amount of time to make the most of his fresher tyres. Frentzen made his stop a second quicker than Hakkinen, rejoining behind the Finn as Alesi finally made his stop, releasing Hill and then rejoining behind Herbert once more. So the top 6 had remained in the same order, but now Schumacher was within 5 seconds of Coulthard and closing, and was over 16 seconds ahead of Hill in 3rd. Irvine had also had a long stop and ended up behind both McLarens, as off-camera Frentzen had passed Hakkinen for 9th, with the 2 McLarens now sandwiching Barrichello and Coulthard approaching to lap the lot of them. None of them proved too much of a difficulty to lap, even the usually feisty Hakkinen, but it all took time, and Schumacher was closing all the while. By the time David was passed, it was lap 33 of the 71, and nearly time for the second pit stops for those on 3. Berger was the first in, while Schumacher was lapping Blundell and Barrichello, but before he could set about his old F3 rival Hakkinen, Schumacher pitted. Another great stop, getting him out behind Hill, and Herbert followed suit, a quick stop too, but he was fractionally delayed getting away as Brundle was just coming in. And then it was race leader Coulthard, a slightly slow stop, losing him the lead for the first time as Hill went through. Williams had decided at this point to switch Hill to a 2-stop strategy to try and get him at least ahead of Schumacher, but Hill was in a huge queue of traffic and was losing time. Coulthard, on the other hand, was flying once more, rapidly closing on his teammate, aided by Barrichello getting out of his way by pitting. A quick stop, but the Brazilian was having brake problems now. Hill was stuck behind Irvine as Coulthard appeared behind him, so now the 2 Williamses were together, with no backmarkers in the way once Irvine had moved. Coulthard knew, though, that Hill was about to make his second and now final stop, putting in a big fuel load and running to the end, so he didn't want to risk overtaking, but Hill's tyres were losing grip so badly that Coulthard nearly collided with the back of him before Damon finally peeled in on lap 44, restoring Coulthard to the lead. It was a pretty quick stop, putting Hill back out on the track 25 seconds behind Schumacher in 3rd, so now his race would hinge on whether, when the Benetton made its 3rd stop, he would get and then stay ahead. Berger fumed in for his 3rd stop on lap 46, having been stuck behind 2-stopper Alesi ever since his 2nd, and then Alesi made his 2nd and final stop a couple of laps later, rejoining behind the Austrian anyway. Hakkinen's engine died between those two, putting him out after a trying weekend following his celebrations at Monza. As the remaining 2 stoppers, Irvine and Bouillon, visited the pits, and Montemini was called back in for a speeding penalty, Coulthard had finally got a few clear laps and was now pulling away from Schumacher again, the gap now 6.2 seconds on lap 50, while Hill was also closing the gap on the German, now less than 20 seconds behind, which ought to put him up to 2nd when Schumacher pitted. Herbert had benefited from good Benetton pit work again to go ahead of the Ferraris and up to 4th, but both he and Berger, 5th, would need to stop again, while 6th placed Alesi wouldn't. On lap 53 it was Coulthard in for his crucial final stop, and just as he was getting out after 9 seconds stationary, Schumacher was in for his, 2 seconds quicker, but not quick enough to get out ahead of Hill. So, with 18 laps to go and no more stops, Coulthard led Hill by a whisker over 7 seconds, while Hill led Schumacher by a little over 2.8 seconds. Herbert came in and went out, seeing two-stopper Frentzen go past just as he emerged now 7th. Hill was suffering from worn tyres again, though, and Coulthard was quickly stretching the lead as Schumacher hove into view behind the Williams, which was visibly struggling for grip. Barrichello made his final stop, in from 9th and down to 11th, but with 10 laps to go, Schumacher was now right behind Hill, and once again battle was joined. There was previous form between the two, of course, but on both previous occasions where they'd been coming together, the situation had been reversed, Hill chasing Schumacher, and both were still racing under suspended bans. Not that Hill was going to make this easy, but his tyres were shot and he knew it. At that tight turn 9 hairpin, Schumacher dived inside, forced Hill wide, and it was all over. Once through, Schumacher simply disappeared into the distance while Hill was just trying to husband his tyres to the end of the race. Schumacher put his foot down to see if he could catch Coulthard, or at least position himself to take advantage of yet another late car problem for the Scot. But not this time. The FW17 lasted the last few laps as David Coulthard came home to take his maiden win, becoming the first Scottish Grand Prix winner since Jackie Stewart in 1973 and the third new winner of the 1995 season. Schumacher crossed the line second, and Hill held on for third. The two Ferraris finished nose to tail, having been fighting their own private battle for most of the race. In the end, Berger, 3 stops, led home a lazy, 2 stops, and Frentzen picked up the final point after a good drive from the back of the grid in a race with relatively few retirements. Hill and Schumacher privately shook hands as they went through the weigh-in, well, as privately as they could with cameras everywhere, and then they all took to the podium, both of the title contenders clearly delighted for Coulthard after all his bad luck. Jean Alesi, meanwhile, was absolutely furious after the race. He had been asked by Giorgio Ascanelli and Jean Todt to let Berger pass at around the halfway point, with the Austrian on a 3-stop strategy and being obviously held up behind the Frenchman who was husbanding his tyres. "I've had enough," Alesi stormed. "Ascanelli isn't Ferrari's engineer, he's Berger's." He said his own engineer wasn't being shown all the data, and ended up by saying he would race according to his own circumstances and not tot radio. He even suggested that the Ferrari boss was deliberately sowing discord between himself and Berger to poison the well for Benetton next year, which the team naturally denied. Quote, "Both drivers knew each other's strategies and knew what was in the team's best interest," said Todd. But while Berger agreed that Jean probably should have let him past, noting he'd done the same for other teammates in the past, he also knew Alesi's tendency to shoot his mouth off and wasn't going to take it personally. And so Schumacher eked out another 2 points in the title race, but with 4 still to go, he couldn't sew it up on home ground in Germany as he might have hoped, while Coulthard moved ahead of Herbert into 3rd, further demoting Alesi down to 5th. Williams, meanwhile, had closed up a bit in the constructors' race, now 12 points behind Benetton and 16 ahead of Ferrari. The next race was in just 7 days' time at the Nürburgring, halfway across Europe, for the European Grand Prix, so the teams had a bit of a job on to pack everything up for the long drive from Portugal to the Eifel Mountains of Western Germany.
I care.